Good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Montgomery. I'm Professor of Design and Director of Brexit and Sustainability at Ulster University, and I'm also a Belfast Healthy Cities Board member. So a very warm welcome on this beautiful sunny morning. I'm delighted to be here today at the launch of the Place and Planet chapters as part of the Belfast Health Profile. Everybody is encouraged to add questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and the presentations of the speakers will be recorded and uploaded onto the Belfast Healthy Cities website. If you're using Twitter, could you use the hashtag HealthyBelfast, or perhaps include @BelfastHealthy in any tweets that you might send out. So the purpose of today's webinar, it's the fourth in a series of webinars to launch the City Health Profile as such, and this event will focus on the launch of the Place and Planet chapters. We're absolutely delighted to be joined today by Erica Eisen, who is Expert Advisor to Healthy Cities, by Victoria Ramsey, from the Urban Climate Services team at the Met Office, and from Joan Devlin, who is the Chief Executive of Belfast Healthy Cities. Presenters will highlight key points of the data and opportunities to use it to inform work taking place to tackle inequalities across Belfast. I would also like to thank the wide range of partners involved in developing this place of work for their time and their continued support. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to welcome Joan Devlin to join us today, and I'd like to invite her to speak on developing healthy places and planet health. Joan is Chief Executive of Belfast Healthy Cities. She really needs no introduction because I'm sure a lot of you will know her, but she has extensive experience of working locally with communities and engaging other sectors to develop collaborative ways to promote health and well-being and to reduce inequalities. So I'll just pass across to Joan.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good morning, everyone. Many of you will know that Belfast has been a member of the WHO European Healthy Cities Network from 1988, actually. We're now in phase 7, and you can see in the background the phase. Every 5 years we have a different framework that WHO provide us with, and you can see in the background here the framework for phase 7, which is the 6P framework, which many of you now will be familiar with. And the Lord Mayor hosts a workshop at the beginning of each 5-year phase in Belfast, and from that the local stakeholders identify what are the priorities for action. So for this 5-year phase within the Healthy Places theme, there are a number of issues, and within that are healthy urban planning, green spaces, energy and health. And within the planet theme, the issues are climate change, protected biodiversity, and water and sanitation. But for a number of years now, and for phase 7, Belfast chose to work on healthy transport, greening the city. And they're not very tangible concepts. So in an effort to make those concepts into reality, we actually have been working for a number of years on healthy places and walkability, particularly with older people. And we've worked at a policy level in terms of trying to influence some local policy. But when we were given healthy urban planning a number of phases ago, it was very difficult. How do you make that actually? How do you turn that? How do you make that tangible? So, healthy urban planning actually brings us back to the roots of public health. So if we go back to the early 20th century when sanitation improved, the quality of water improved, housing improved, that actually brings us to the roots of public health. So in terms of turning the concept of healthy urban planning, or which is now more commonly known as healthy places, into reality, the issue of child-friendly places was chosen. And we've worked on a number of projects since that. But this is a slide I've taken from Erica Eisen a number of years ago, actually. And this is very much about why would we work on the built environment and children's health. So we can see here, the built environment is linked to physical activity, it's linked to injuries, it's linked to air pollution. and carbon emissions. And for older people, it's also linked to depression and osteoporosis and a number of other areas. So that's the rationale in terms of working on the built environment and health. And we do know that, for example, in relation to inequalities, there are a higher number of children injured by cars, even though car ownership in areas of deprivation are very low. So we have to keep in mind throughout all of this inequalities in health. But our work on child-friendly places actually began probably now about 8 to 10 years ago, when it was very much about, trying to provide or teach children what is the relationship between the built environment. In those days, children were given disposable cameras. We moved on very quickly to the use of iPads for that. But the work then developed into a child-friendly places action plan. And within that had the 3 core themes: engaging and empowering children, creating healthy places, and strengthening child-centred spatial planning and design. Then, because the first Shaping Healthier Neighbourhoods was actually really successful, the teachers came to us and asked us, would we develop a resource that they could use in relation to the world around us, the curriculum of the world around us. So, and I think the success of this was very much the common agenda. On the one hand, it suited the schools, with their curriculum. And on the other hand, it suited Healthy Cities and Public Health Agency, who funded a lot of this in relation to that relationship between environment and health. As part of the European network, we also then, some of the schools actually wanted to develop relationships with other schools across the network. So these are the cities across WHO Europe in which it was piloted. And at the launch, the first celebration event, we actually had a school from Athens over to celebrate that. So that's actually online. It's still very popular with children. And these are some of the examples of how actually it was implemented. Some schools were really ambitious and were really successful in getting funding for. The idea was that the children actually looked at their environment around the school area or within the school area and developed a project that would actually, where the environment could change and become much more healthier for their local neighbourhood or their school grounds. So the diagrams on the left-hand side, unfortunately, that was where children in that school just wanted their school railings actually painted. But on the other side, actually, some of the schools were really successful in getting funding, for example, from DFC and others in relation to improvements in the area. And since that, we've also heard where a number of schools actually have made successful applications to urban villages for funding the projects that the children developed. Alongside that, and this is all part of how you promote a concept that's relatively new in a city. So we very much promoted the Kids Space event, and with indoor and outdoor events. And that actually became a major part of the European Night of Culture every year. And this was Boys Park a number of years ago, now known as Cathedral Gardens. But it actually was very much part of that whole Friday evening. And from that then, following the Primark fire, actually City Council they've always had play parks, but this is very much about creating pop-up play parks where previously we might have not had green space. And that's also about the relationship between green space and children's health. This is another example. So we did try a number of ways in terms of how we promote and how we actually mainstream that concept of child-friendly places. This was where we worked with RTPI, the Ulster Museum, and the students, where actually the students actually developed a model of a city, and you can see some of the models there. And then the children decided what kind of a city they would actually like. And then in relation to this, a number of planners were asking for, well, how do we engage children? And that's an area that if you're not working in that area, it can be a little bit challenging. So we actually created guidelines on engaging children. And then we worked with James Hennessy from the Ministerial Advisory Group, DFC, a part of the Paul Hogarth Company, in terms of designing places for children and young people. So both these are available on our website, and we're now speaking to a lot of departments on how actually some of these could be implemented. So that's been very much the Healthy Places. It is now developed into what the walking bus. Some of you might be familiar with the walking bus concept, but again, this is about, the focus is very much on healthy places for children. So this was, how do we reduce car dependency in relation to planet and place, and increase the number of children walking to school, both for their mental but also for their physical health. And this was actually there where we had the first pilot of this during Walk to School Week in May, just this year, with 3 schools in the care zone, the Old Park area where we currently are working. And to sort of attract attention or highlight it, make it more fun for the children, we had the Wizard of Oz characters leading out on that. So one of the schools actually had developed a small pilot, and part of the purpose was to strengthen that, Ballysullen Primary School. And the second, one of the other schools that we worked with, Our Lady's Denby Gardens, has maintained the walking bus until the end of the school year. So we're hoping actually now to roll that out with some of the schools in East Belfast in September. We also worked with WHO in terms of age-friendly environments, AFI, where we had it was really to look at how do we make the built environment more age-friendly so that older people can benefit from that, both in terms of being able to get out and about, in terms of their mental health, but also their ability to continue to walk to their local shops and neighbourhoods. So we created a number of walkability assessments, and here are some with both in the parks but also in the streets, in neighbourhoods and in the city centre. And that identified, you can see there, the obstacles in terms of older people walking. So, street clutter, difficulties crossing the road, and many of you will have heard that sometimes the lights actually don't stay on long enough. The pedestrian walking light doesn't stay on long enough for older people to get across the way, and good quality footpath. And one of the other issues in relation to this is actually toilets for older people in parks as well. So those recommendations have been made and have been put to both DFI and City Council. And we're also involved with MTAC's campaign on no pavement parking. And some of you will be familiar with, London, you can no longer park your car on the pavement, and legislation has now been introduced into Scotland. So the result of that has been very much a walk assessment toolkit, which is on our website, and is actually used by a number of other cities now across Europe. But in terms of, we have been very much supported in the early days with the concept of healthy urban planning with the WHO Collaborating Centre on the Built Environment. And it was they who created many of you will be familiar with this health map now. And that's looking at how actually, the whole environment affects people, where people actually live. We shape places, places shape us. We're now, I think, Planet, actually, for a lot of people as well, a number of voluntary organisations have been working on this area for a while. But for us, for Phase 7 of the Planet Health, we are focusing on greening for health. And we had a really successful workshop yesterday morning looking at what does that involve in terms of taking actions forward. And some of the organisations that are there are saying, one of the key obstacles in terms of taking forward a lot of this work is the lack of joint working. So there was lots of organisations saying, let's collectively see what we can do to actually improve the health in relation to the local population. And again, Greening for Health is very much, if you look at the deprivation and inequalities, why do people in poor communities not use the green space that's there? What are the obstacles to using that? And these are some of the areas that we actually need to be looking at to find a systematic way in which the green space that we have in the city is used to its maximum. Again, supported by this are some of the WHO documents. You might want to look at these, and our own Professor Ruth Hunter, who's a member of our board, was actually involved in some of these documents as well from Queen's University. But in relation to the whole area of planet health and climate change, many years ago, actually, we created under Minister McGimpsey, so we are going back a while, we created Climate Change and Health Group, and as part of that, and that was very much trying to introduce a new concept as then as well, we actually conducted a number of green travel plans, and that is now an integral part of Climate NI. You know, we've worked with City Council in terms of the local development plan, looking at, we had worked with a previous minister and looking at takeaway food policies, or food takeaway policies in relation to a number of schools, and a number of people were concerned that there are the increase in fast food bars, particularly close to secondary schools. So we were looking at that. And again, we've legislation in England actually to reduce that. We've conducted a wide range of health impact assessments on a number of master plans. And we actually have rolled out a number of training programs, briefing papers, newsletters, and some of you, as far back as 2009, we have been trying to look at the relation to build capacity in terms of the built environment, healthy urban planning, and health. So yeah, that's basically a summary of what we've been doing to date, and we do continue to look forward to actually working on the Green in the City project with many of our partners from here on in. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Joan. Fantastic array of work being undertaken by Belfast Healthy Cities across youth, the elderly, walking, greening the city, travel policy, so a whole array of different aspects of a healthy life in Belfast. So I'd just like to thank you, Joan, for the overview that you've presented there. If you have any questions for Joan as part of the Q&A after the presentations, can you please submit those to the chat box? We're also now delighted, or I'm delighted personally, to welcome Erica Eisen, who's the expert advisor to Healthy Cities, to speak on the City Health Profile, Place and Planet chapters. Erica is the author of the report chapters and has presented many other chapters too. Erica has worked in the health sector for over 30 years, working across the spectrum from acute care to public health. She now specialises in public health, but looks at the public health aspect of healthcare as well as the protection and promotion of health for communities and populations. Erica has been an expert advisor to various parts of the World Health Organization since 2003, so we're absolutely delighted to welcome you, Erica.
Thank you, Ian, and hello again, everyone, for those of you who've been at previous launches virtually. Again, I have the pleasure of being in Belfast, which is, apart from home in Oxford, one of my favourite cities. A brief rider to my talk. We're launching 2 chapters today. As those of you who have been before will know, I tend to overtalk. I tend to want to give you every piece of data. So this presentation has been very difficult for me to try and select some of the information in the profile from 2 chapters. So forgive me if I don't cover things that you're particularly interested in, but then I would encourage you to take the opportunity to look at the profiles in more detail. They're both very extensive and we have lots of information and diagrams in there. So if I don't present what you're particularly interested in today, my apologies up front. Okay, so I thought I'd start this presentation with a slide you've seen before. This is going back to our old friend, Northern Ireland's measure of multiple deprivation. I've put all 7 domains on here, but obviously today we're concentrating on the domain that is to do with the living environment. So that happens to be, luckily, with the Microsoft colouring, the green one, happily. So just to start off in terms of the 4 assembly areas within Belfast, we can see that actually quite a lot of areas in the city are deprived in terms of the living environment. So what the graph shows you is the percentage of super output areas. Those are areas of about 1,000 to 4,000 people on average across the city, living in a small geographical jurisdiction. So you can see that Belfast West has the highest percentage of super output areas that are deprived for the environment, but relatively closely followed by both Belfast North and Belfast South. So it's only when we go to Belfast East that we can see that around 20% of the super output areas there are deprived for the environment, whereas if we look at Belfast West, then you're looking at around 47%. So you can see just from taking a quick look at this one graph that actually the living environment is an issue in the city, and that's reflected in both the place and the planet chapters. So I'm going to concentrate on some of the place information first, and then we'll move on to planet. But what I'm also trying to do is link up some of the information in place with some of the information in planet. So forgive me if we pop around a bit. Just to give you some basic facts in terms of place, the two main sets of indicators within place are to do with housing and to do with transport. So in terms of Belfast's housing stock, there is a higher percentage of apartments, terraces and semi-detached dwellings. There's a lower percentage of owner-occupied dwellings and therefore a higher percentage of social rented sector dwellings. This becomes very important later on when we begin to look at housing need, housing applications and homelessness. So bear that in mind. We've got a higher percentage of social rented sector dwellings here. And there is also, and again, bear this fact in mind when we begin to look at some of the planet data for carbon emissions, electricity consumption, we have a higher percentage in Belfast of dwellings built from a range of before 1918 to up to 1965. And if you look at some of the data in the profile that shows you the age of dwellings in other local government districts, it is very noticeable that Belfast has a lot of the older dwellings. So if we look at housing conditions, and again, this becomes important when we start to think about carbon emissions, we have a higher percentage of dwellings compared with Northern Ireland that have any form of disrepair. There are several forms, I won't go into them, we don't have time. And we have a higher percentage of dwellings than Northern Ireland not meeting the decent home standard. So there's two areas that could be improved. However, when we look at other standards, the fitness standard, there is actually a lower percentage of dwellings that are deemed unfit and compared with Northern Ireland, and also a lower percentage of dwellings that have housing health and safety rating system category 1 hazards. And category 1 hazards are the hazards that pose a serious risk to a person's health and safety. And finally, there's a lower percentage of dwellings deemed to be overcrowded against the bedroom standard. But in conversations with Joan and other colleagues at Belfast Healthy Cities, this data, some people may not agree with it in terms of how the bedroom standard is measured. So what I'd like to concentrate on now to make, as I said, one of the connections between the place chapter and the planet chapter is to look at energy efficiency in Belfast's housing. So bearing in mind what we've already said, that the housing in Belfast tends to be older, it's actually quite surprising when you look at the energy efficiency rating. That's where houses are rated from bands A to G in terms of their energy efficiency. So to be most energy efficient, you need to be in bands A to C. And there's also what's known as the mean SAP rating. SAP stands for Standard Assessment Procedure. Not very exciting title. Anyway, if we look at this, on the left-hand side of the slide, what we've got is the energy efficiency rating. Belfast is the, if we're working from the left-hand side of the slide, Belfast is the fourth across. If you can't read the labels, I tried to make them as big as I could. And we will see that despite the age of the dwellings in Belfast, Belfast has the best energy efficiency rating It's the kind of mid-blue colour. So you can see that large bar showing that around 65% of the dwellings in Belfast are in band A to C, which is the best band for energy efficiency, and that's despite the age of the dwellings. So Belfast does best for energy efficiency, and this is also shown by the slide on the right-hand side, where Belfast is the column with the sort of ochre colour. Other LGDs are in the mid-blue colour, and Northern Ireland is in a pale grey. So that you can see in terms of the mean SAP rating, Belfast has the best mean SAP, over 70. The horizontal line going through the graph shows you the threshold for energy efficiency. So there are other LGDs that are doing quite well, but you can see that Belfast is doing by far the best. So that's a real positive, despite the age of the dwelling stock. In terms of the number of people that live in housing, Belfast tends to be relatively dominated by having a higher percentage of one-person households compared with Northern Ireland, and lower percentages of 4- and 5-person households compared with the rest of the country, which means that actually not only does Belfast have a lower average household size compared with Northern Ireland, but it's also got the lowest average household size of all local government districts. There again, in terms of household types, Belfast has a higher percentage of one adult households and one adult households with children, and then lower percentages of other types of households. But our populations below 75 and over 75 are similar to those in Northern Ireland as a whole. So what does that mean if we're just taking that brief run through the population data? It's all in beautiful figures in the profile. What does that mean in terms of housing demand that we're looking at? Well, one of the things we can look at are the housing growth indicators for 2030. So the calculations are that Belfast will need 7,400 new dwellings, and that only represents about 8.73% of Northern Ireland's total requirement of new dwellings, which is almost 85,000. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the bar chart. Belfast is in the rust colour, almost halfway down. So Belfast, according to the housing growth indicators, has only got the 5th highest new dwelling requirement, but I'd like you to bear that in mind before we move on to some of the other data that shows us housing need in the city, which I'm sure as many of you listening today, you will be well aware of. So let's look at housing supply now in terms of new dwelling completions. So to read the graph on the left-hand side, what the sort of mid-blue bar shows is total new dwelling completions. The ochre colour or rust colour shows us the new dwelling completions in the private stroke speculative sector, and the grey bars show us the social housing new dwelling completions. Now, this graph is a bit misleading. When you're working with data, normally just putting up raw numbers isn't very meaningful, especially when you're comparing a population in a capital city like Belfast with a population in rural Northern Ireland. So I have done these as percentages. So at the moment, again, Belfast is the 4th set of columns in. If you look at it, it looks like, ooh, Belfast does have a high percentage of the social housing new dwelling completions, which, as we've already looked at, it needs. However, if we look at the numbers, which are very important in this case, there were only 710 new dwellings completed in 2019 for the whole of Northern Ireland, and 176 of those were in Belfast. So actually, even though we have a high percentage of the new dwelling completions for social housing, the numbers are very low and actually don't meet the social housing need that there is in the city. So if we look at the homelessness data, Homelessness presentations in Belfast for 2019 were almost a third of the homelessness presentations for all of Northern Ireland. The acceptances of homelessness, so you can make an application to be classified as homeless. So the acceptances, which are made by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, acceptances of homelessness in Belfast, again, was almost a third of the acceptances for the whole country. When we're looking at those households that have then been accepted as homeless, over a third of the households accepted as homeless in Belfast were placed in temporary accommodation. So those of you who already know the evidence base will know that actually being placed in temporary accommodation can be very damaging for health and well-being, physical and mental, not just for adults, but in particular for children and young people. Compared with other local government districts in Northern Ireland, Belfast had the highest numbers and the highest percentages of homelessness presentations and acceptances. So housing is a real issue. When we look at the data, extending this in housing need, for those of you who know, apologies for explaining, but some households are classified as being in housing stress, which show that their needs are extreme. And this is generally based on health and well-being issues, whether people have diabetes, a disability, the number of children they have. And I'm afraid there isn't much data for these chapters for particular areas of Belfast. I'm trying to share it where I can. Here on the left-hand side of the slide, we have the number, not the percentage, but the number of households in housing stress for Belfast East, North, South and West. And as you can see, the mid-blue bar shows you 17-18 data, the rust-colored bar shows you 19-20 data. And as we can see, the number of households in housing stress is going up in all areas of Belfast, but the numbers are really high, particularly in Belfast North and Belfast West. If we look at the graph on the right, that shows us for the whole city in relation to other local government districts that Belfast has by far the biggest share of Northern Ireland's households in housing stress. And even though Belfast is the capital city, it's much larger than the other local government districts. Belfast's percentage share of households in housing stress is double, and more than double for most places than anywhere else in Northern Ireland. So, the waiting list for social housing in Northern Ireland, people have to apply each financial year to go on the housing waiting list for social housing. So it's not a cumulative list, it is the list of the number of people that have applied each year. So more than a quarter of all of Northern Ireland's total applications were from Belfast for social housing. Remember how low we saw the social housing completions were for Belfast, just over 100 houses, and yet more than a quarter of Northern Ireland's applications are in Belfast. The households in housing stress are approaching 1/3, and the total allocations to social housing in Belfast comprise more than a quarter of Northern Ireland's total allocations. So there's a large housing need in the city, particularly for social housing need, and it's not being met. We also have a bit of data, thanks to the University of Ulster and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, who look at average monthly rent, and this is in the private sector. So this is just private sector average monthly rent. We have what are known as housing submarkets in Belfast. So the areas, even though it says east, west, south, north, etc., these do not reflect the assembly areas. They are the housing submarket areas, because one of the main submarkets in Belfast is the city centre anyway. I've also put on the far right-hand side of this graph the data for Belfast, but as you can see, from the data, city centre for the period July to December 2019, the average monthly rent in the private sector was over £800, which was reflected as well in South, which is where there are also a lot of houses of multiple occupation, particularly around Queen's University. So that's some of the more local data we were able to show. But to put this in relation to housing related benefits, the benefits data is a bit complicated. As you know, there's a transition within the UK as a whole from having housing benefit data to then everybody transitioning onto universal credit. And there is part of universal credit that has a housing element. As those of you who know, who've been on these presentations before, we have used as our baseline pre-pandemic data so that we can then look at the impact of the pandemic. So, this coincided, unhappily, in data terms, with a transition for a different way of collecting the data, and also the transition from housing benefit to universal credit with a housing element. So it's been very difficult for this period in time to identify exactly how many people are receiving a benefit due to housing. However, we've got some data that gives us an indication. In Belfast, almost 40,000 households were receiving housing benefit in 2019. In terms of tenants, the different types of tenants, about almost 30% of housing executive tenants were receiving housing benefit. For housing association tenants, 40% of tenants were receiving housing benefit, and in the private rented sector, it was almost 20%. So again, not just do we have a high level of housing need, but with the levels of deprivation in Belfast, there's a high level of receipt of housing benefits. Moving quickly on to travel, because I want to make some connections with Planet. In terms of journeys by main mode, this is part of the good news story about Belfast. We have in Belfast a higher percentage of people walking, cycling, and a lower percentage of people using a car. In some instances, that's because there are large areas of deprivation in Belfast and people can't afford a car. But what that means is that if we look at the number of people who walk and cycle, the Belfast colours here are the blue and the rust colour. Northern Ireland colours are grey and sort of a kind of dirty yellow, I suppose. And this is comparative data from 14-16, the blue bar for Belfast, and 17-19 for the ochre sort of rusty colour. So you can see that actually 30% of journeys, the main mode is walking in Belfast, whereas it is lower for Northern Ireland. Cycling is also higher, but less people cycle. But we can see as well, Northern Ireland uses their car. Up to 70% of journeys by main mode is by car, compared with just over 50% in Belfast. If we look at the sort of stacked bar chart on the right-hand side, we can see Belfast is the fourth bar down from the top. If we look at the blue, orange, grey, and sort of dirty yellow ochre colour, which are all how frequently do you use public transport, blue is every day. The ochre is at least once a week, grey is at least every two to 3 weeks, and the dirty yellow colour is at least once a month. You can see that Belfast uses public transport a lot more than any other local government district. Bear this in mind when we're looking at the carbon emissions data. I know this is in part because Belfast may have a better public transport system than other areas of Northern Ireland, but when we're thinking about our carbon emissions, then this is very important data that actually in terms of active travel, use of public transport, Belfast is doing very well. Could do better, we could all do better, but it's doing very well. Then we're looking at the likelihood of walking up to 2 miles or 3 kilometres. Again, Belfast comes out the best on the left-hand graph, fourth in, same for the right. The interesting data, though, on the right-hand side of the graph, I've put up people's satisfaction with the provision for walkers and walking, which bears on a lot of the good work that Belfast Healthy Cities has already done on the ground with the walking assessments that Joan's talked about, both looking at it for children and older people. Although Belfast has the highest percentage of people within local government districts who are satisfied with the provision for walking, you will see in the Belfast set of two columns, it's 1718 data is the blue, 1920 data is the sort of ochre colour, and you can see the percentage of people satisfied in Belfast is decreasing. So maybe there is an issue there to keep people walking. We need to look at some of our walking infrastructure and use some of the data that Joan and colleagues have collected on the walking assessments. My final slide on place is to do with transport poverty, which is something that Joan and colleagues will be taking up in Belfast Healthy Cities. There is not an official transport poverty indicator, either developed at government level or that's been sort of agreed on by anybody if you go to the literature. So what we did here was we had to take the basic data I could find, which is just weekly household expenditure on transport for Northern Ireland, so it's not Belfast data. But what you can see on the right-hand side is that transport, and this covers all sorts of things like repairs, fuel, as well as cost of a car or other forms of transport, what you spend on public transport. You can see that transport is the largest expenditure from the weekly household expenditure. Now, I know Joan and colleagues want to look at other things to do with transport poverty in terms of accessibility, but given the cost of living crisis that everybody is facing now, the cost of transport is also going to be a key factor in that. So this was just to get some idea of what transport poverty might look like. For those of you who know fuel poverty, the threshold is normally considered to be 10%. For transport poverty, it's around 14 to 15% of the budget. And so average over Northern Ireland is slightly higher than 15%, but that could be an issue for a lot of people living in the more deprived areas of the country, let alone Belfast. So that was just to highlight that that's something coming up with Belfast Healthy Cities in future. I think, Joan, you're going to be working with people in Fermanagh? Yeah. Okay, Planet. I'm probably running behind, so I'll give you a quick race through. Belfast has the lowest capacity for and generation of electricity from renewable sources, so that's something that could be looked at in future. On the good side, it has the second lowest amount of any LGD of household waste generated, so that's good. But then if we look at how much you recycle, you're also second lowest. So maybe, okay, you're good at reducing the amount of waste, but maybe we need to recycle more. In terms of noise complaints in the local environment, got the highest rate and the highest number of noise complaints of any other local government district, and both of which are increasing. So obviously noise is becoming more of a problem in the city. In terms of the number and rate of notices served for noise complaints, the number and rate are increasing, but the number of notices served is decreasing. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there with the data. In terms of air quality, there are 4 air quality management areas in Belfast. All of them are looking at nitrogen dioxide, and subsequent to the establishment of one, particulate matter 2.5, the finest matter, was added. Belfast also has 2 sites in the UK's automatic urban and rural network. Nitrogen dioxide level at 2 sites are decreasing, so that's good. PM2.5s are only measured at 1 site and levels are decreasing for that. So the air quality data is looking good. Bear this in mind now when we come onto the carbon emissions data, but Belfast represents the largest area of significant flood risk in Northern Ireland. In terms of the river basin that you're in, there are 3 main river basins in Northern Ireland, 2 of which are shared with the Republic, but the North East River Basin of which Belfast, the Lagan, the Belfast Lough, etc., are all part. If we look at the quality of the rivers, it has the lowest percentage of rivers of high and of good status. If we try and focus in on the Lagan, then for the majority of sampling sites on the natural water bodies part of the Lagan, overall status is moderate. But if we look at the heavily modified water bodies, that's where the river is enclosed by things like impounded, it's called, by the roads. If you're in the centre of Belfast, then you measure the ecological potential, and for those parts of the Lagan, it's either moderate or poor. So water quality is something that does need to be improved in the area, especially when we're looking at the importance of green and blue space for people's mental health and well-being, let alone the importance of blue space and green space and how we use that to manage climate change. There's a whole raft on the left-hand side. I'm showing you a box of all the indicators we have in the profile for carbon emissions. The good news for Belfast, and it's excellent, is even though it's the capital city, the largest place, for all of the carbon emissions data we have in there, all of these indicators, the trends in carbon emissions are decreasing. However, the not so good news is that according to the Belfast Climate Commission, even though your carbon emissions are coming down, that radical action is needed in order for Belfast to reach net zero by 2030. For those of you who know, the Belfast Climate Commission developed a net zero roadmap for 2030 for Belfast. The most fair thing to do in terms of looking at Belfast carbon emissions is to look at carbon emissions per capita, because there are so many people in the city. Of course, if we just look at total carbon emissions, Belfast doesn't do so well because, it's a large urban area. But if we look at carbon emissions per person, then Belfast has the second lowest, as you can see on the left-hand graph. Now, it's quite difficult to get specific data sometimes for comparisons. So what I've got on the right-hand side is looking at Belfast compared with other capital cities in the UK. So we have London, Edinburgh, Cardiff. For the particular report I took this from, Centre for Cities did this. They have Belfast PUA, which is actually Belfast City and Lisbon and Castlereagh lumped in together. That's what it's called, Belfast Primary Urban Area. But what I've done is then put the Belfast LGD data on top of that, which is transposing it from the left-hand side onto the right, but I've got a larger scale on the bottom. So Belfast carbon emissions per capita is 4.2 tonnes. And you can see that actually that is higher than both, it's higher than London and Edinburgh. Cardiff is higher, but Belfast and Lisbon combined is higher than all the rest. But I think that's a slightly unfair comparison, and I'm not at all sure why Centre for Cities lumped in Lisbon. I couldn't find anything in the metadata to explain it, but there we are. If we look at different sectors and their carbon emissions, and on the left-hand side is housing, on the right-hand side is transport. If you remember, Belfast is good for walking. It's really good for not using your car as much as other local government district. So in terms of transport, Belfast is shown by the rust-coloured bar, and you can see that Belfast is in the lower half among local government districts for the total carbon emissions from the transport sector, which I think is pretty good for a capital city. But if we look at the left-hand side, that's the carbon emissions from the domestic sector within the scope of local authority. And you can see that Belfast's carbon emissions, although they are decreasing, the domestic sector is actually your main source of carbon emissions, and that needs to be looked at. The difficulty there is, as we've already seen earlier on, you have a large amount of pre-1965 housing stock, which is more difficult to retrofit in terms of carbon emissions. So this is just from the net zero roadmap for Belfast, and this shows you that actually housing is the growing sector in terms of carbon emissions within the total Belfast footprint, whereas public and commercial buildings, transport and industry, the carbon emissions are all decreasing, whereas they're increasing for housing. So that's one of the key targets to look at in future. In terms of climate change projections, I've used the Northern Ireland climate risk assessment here because it does actually use Belfast data and compares it with other capital cities, whereas the most recent data from the Hadley Centre, which is part of the Met Office, actually just uses a point in central Northern Ireland and a point in central England, which didn't seem to have much resonance. So if we look at the climate change projections on the left-hand side, this is looking at winter rainfall accumulation. You can see that this is increasing, so that Belfast winter rainfall accumulation by 2041 to 2060 will be getting towards 80 millimetres over 5 days. If we look at the right-hand graph, we're looking at daily maximum summer temperatures. Belfast goes from 26 to about 28 by the end of 2060. And I will say that all the data for the projections, I use the medium emissions scenario. So it's not the best case and it's not the worst case. This is the medium emissions scenario. This is just to make a point. On the left-hand side, we're looking at what are known as aggregated annual average damages. This is due to flood risk. As we've already seen in the earlier data, Belfast is the largest area of significant flood risk in Northern Ireland, and this is reflected in the annual average damages expected due to flood risk. On the right-hand side of the graph, this is thanks to colleagues at Climate Northern Ireland. I was speaking to Stephen yesterday. Hi, Stephen. And what they've done is they've got an extreme weather events timeline, and they do it in 4-year blocks, 2000 to 2004. So I've looked at the data up to 2019, and you can just see this is data in extreme weather events for Northern Ireland, not for Belfast, but you can see the exponential increase in extreme weather events. So this could be extreme rainfall, extreme heat, extreme cold, storms, sea surges, all the extreme weather events. So global climate change is something we have to contend with. And I think that graph on the right is pretty frightening in terms of the exponential increase that Northern Ireland has been through in terms of extreme weather events. So the climate change hazards that have been predicted to have the greatest impact on Belfast are sea level rise and flood risk. So by 2100, sea level rise in Belfast, and again, I've used the medium emissions scenario data, will range from 0.18 to 0.64 meters. By 2015, what this means is that almost 8,000 Belfast properties will be at risk of flooding. 6,000 of those will be residential, and almost 2,000 of those will be commercial. Finally, I was going to try and end on a positive slide. I don't know how you'll feel about this, but we've put in some of the data about public attitudes to forestry with regard to climate change. So actually, this is Northern Ireland data, again, 2019, but there are actually quite high percentages of people who see trees as good because they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in wood. So if we take this opinion survey run by Forest NI as an indicator of public attitudes towards global climate change and what needs to be done, I think this gives us a positive view. And thank you very much. Sorry if I've run over.
Thanks very much, Erica. I mean, that was a fantastic insight. Thank you very much into the place and planet. I started to make notes, and actually I ran out of paper, and I don't think I could do it justice by trying to sum up. So I find that really fascinating. If you have any questions for Erica as part of the Q&A, could you please submit those in the chat box? Now, we know that there was a problem with the chat box earlier on, but it was inadvertently locked, but it's now been sorted out. So moving on then, we're delighted to welcome Victoria Ramsey, Urban Climate Services team from the Urban Climate Services team at the Met Office to speak on an urban heat climate service for Belfast. Victoria is a climate services scientist within the Urban Climate Services team at the Met Office. Her work involves engaging with urban stakeholders to develop novel approaches in delivering climate information in a usable and tailored way to assist decision making. So I'm going to pass across now to Victoria. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Ramsey and I'm part of the Urban Climate Services team at the Met Office. Thank you for having us present today on some of the work that we have been doing with Belfast City Council and Climate Northern Ireland to develop a prototype urban heat climate service for Belfast. This work is funded by the UK Climate Resilience Programme and also the Newton funded Climate Science for Services Partnership China Programme. I just wanted to set the scene and provide some context around why we embarked on this work. In the latest UK climate change risk assessment, the risk to health, well-being and productivity from increased exposure to heat in homes and buildings features as one of the top climate change risks facing the UK. Also, local authorities and city decision makers are recognising the severity of the impacts of extreme heat as they have become more frequent in recent years. This summer, the Met Office issued its first ever red extreme heat warning, and we saw a new temperature record of 40.3 degrees Celsius being set for the UK, a temperature which is virtually impossible for the UK to reach in an undisturbed climate. While the full impacts of this event are still being realised, I have included here a figure from the UK Health Security Agency on the 2020 summer heat waves that caused more than 2,500 excess deaths in England. Heat risks are therefore moving higher up the agenda of local authorities. And this was also evident from feedback that we received from focus groups that we ran with a range of city stakeholders in Belfast to inform this service. It was acknowledged that the current response to extreme heat is more of a reactive one compared to other types of severe weather such as cold and flooding, and more forward planning is needed. Some information gaps that came up included the requirement of health impact information to drive action in other sectors, also mapping where the vulnerable people are within the city, and to identify risks to new and existing development within the built environment. Off the back of these groups, Belfast City Council and Climate Northern Ireland were keen to work with us more closely on this. So we looked at what science was coming through as well as what external information we had, and we came up with this heat service. So this prototype heat service is comprised of two parts. Tier 1, or Part 1, is a set of fact sheets that provide city-specific information on the heat hazard to build awareness and a depth and understanding about heat hazards in cities and to start to introduce the notion of heat risk, which bridges into the second part of this service. Tier 2 provides information on heat risk, which is defined using a heat vulnerability index, and this provides tailored information on heat and vulnerable people, the built environment and green space. And we've identified a number of potential uses of this service, including heat hazard information to inform urban policy design and adaptation. It will help identify current and future hotspots and parts of the city network for priority action, and prepare authorities and utility managers and health agencies for future demand on city services. So this is the heat pack that was produced. It has gone through several rounds of user testing and feedback to get to this final prototype, and I thought I would take you through it. So page 1 provides some introductory information to set the scene on why cities are vulnerable to heat and the impacts of extreme heat. It talks about the urban heat island and impacts to different sectors. Page 2 provides information on current and future temperature trends for the UK as a whole to provide some context. Then page 3 focuses in on Belfast itself and includes a warming stripe showing how temperatures in the city have changed and what they may look like in the future. We also provide some information on past heat events in the city and how the number of extreme heat events have been increasing. Page 4 then provides information on future trends in several impact-based heat indicators that are of importance to the city, and also information on heat waves. I'll come back to these later in more detail, but they are thresholds that are associated with health, water demand and transport disruption. Then pages 5 and 6, we have mapped the changes in some of these heat indicators across the city to provide information on the spatial distribution of heat. Again, I'll come back to these in a bit more detail later on. Page 7 then provides information on what people can do to manage heat events in the city in terms of planning before the event, steps to take during the event, and to build longer-term urban heat resilience. There's also lots of useful web links, documents and reports that are signposted for more information on heatwave preparation. Then finally, page 8 provides information on the science behind the climate projections used within these fact sheets. We use a set of climate projections at a spatial resolution which is on par with current weather forecasting models, which allows us to look at the changes in the climate at much smaller scales, and it captures local processes such as the urban heat island effect, so urban areas are much better represented. The climate information is also for a high emissions scenario where future global greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow beyond current policy commitments. So it allows decision makers to take a more precautionary approach. So looking at the results in a bit more detail for Belfast, this table shows how the number of heat waves and days above certain temperature thresholds are changing for Belfast. The first column is for the recent past, the middle column is the near future, and the final column is for the longer term. The values here are an approximation of the number of days exceeding these thresholds, but there will be many factors influencing this value, including natural variability and local scale processes that are of a higher resolution than the climate model is able to represent. But they give us the best estimate at city level of what we can potentially expect to see in the future. So looking at heatwaves first, the length of heatwaves is set to increase from approximately 4 to 5 days in length towards the end of the century. And we could also experience between 2 to 4 heatwave events in any given year. Also, our heatwaves are getting hotter. If we look at the bottom half of the table, we have looked at the number of days above different thresholds and how they have changed. We've used thresholds that are linked to different impacts. For example, we tend to see a surge in water demand over 22 degrees Celsius, days above 25 degrees Celsius and nights above 15 degrees are important for heat health implications. And we can expect to see an increase in the number of these days exceeding these thresholds, particularly towards the second half of this century. Also, we are seeing more of these days occur outside of the summer period. So as I mentioned previously, we have mapped some of these indicators to see how the number of days exceeding these thresholds change across the city. The maps here are for days above 25 degrees Celsius. We've mapped this to electoral ward areas to make the information more comparable with other data sets, which I'll mention later on. So you can see some of the daytime urban heat island effect within the maps, where the more lower lying built up areas of the city are warmer than the edges that are of slightly higher elevations. And we've overlaid information on locations of key assets within the city, for example, the Great Victoria Street transport hub and the likes of the Royal Victoria Hospital. We've also highlighted parts of the city that might be more exposed or more vulnerable to heat hazards, such as areas with higher deprivation where they may be less able to adapt, or areas with high numbers of elderly people who are at higher risk. So moving on to the second part of this service, we developed a heat vulnerability index for Belfast. And a heat vulnerability index is a method to assess the degree to which people or systems are at risk to extreme heat. It provides a numerical score that allows us to compare one electoral ward to another. So it's a relative comparison used to determine which parts of the city are at greater risk to extreme heat than others. The adverse impacts of heat do not occur equally across populations. How vulnerable people are to heat depends on 3 aspects. The hazard exposure, which is the presence of people in locations that are exposed to high outdoor or indoor temperatures. sensitivity, which is the degree to which people are affected by high temperatures due to, for example, their age or underlying health conditions. And then there's the adaptive capacity, and this is the ability of people to adjust or respond to potential impacts of high temperatures. So we've taken the heat maps that we created for the fact sheets, along with different indicators to represent each of these elements to come up with an index score for each electoral ward in Belfast. We've used data from the NI Statistics and Research Agency, along with data provided by Belfast City Council. And what this produces is a series of maps. We have our hazard exposure maps for 3 time periods. Then we have maps for sensitivity, and then also our adaptive capacity. So in terms of hazard exposure, you can see some of the areas that are more exposed than others, concentrated around the city centre. These areas tend to have higher proportions of apartment buildings, which are at higher risk of overheating, and they also have higher population densities and are located in parts of the city that have a higher number of days above the 25-degree threshold, and the nighttime 15-degree threshold as well. In terms of sensitivity, some areas ranked high in terms of sensitivity, more towards the inner city areas to the north and west. Areas with the lowest sensitivity are clustered towards the city centre, perhaps much younger populations with lower proportions of underlying health conditions, and also there's fewer assets housing vulnerable people potentially in these areas. In terms of adaptive capacity, some areas with high ability to adapt are located to the very north and to the east and southeast of the city, where levels of deprivation are much lower, and there are higher levels of accessible green space. Wards with lower adaptive capacity are similar to sensitivity and are located generally within the west of the city. So we put all of these maps together to give us our overall final risk maps that are presented here, and we have categorised the index scores for each ward into 5 categories ranging from lower risk to higher risk. So this is the results that you get if you just change the temperature component and keep everything else as it is today. And we can see that throughout the century, most wards move to a higher risk category as temperatures rise, particularly towards the end of the century. Some of the inner city wards to the northwest remain at higher risk throughout the century despite temperature increases. These are indicative of wards that have underlying sensitivities such as a higher proportion of the population with underlying health conditions, and also adaptive capacity issues that when combined with heat exposure make them much higher risk. And this gives decision makers a starting point then to further investigate the underlying patterns to inform policy planning and adaptation planning. So we've taken these maps and put them into an ArcGIS story map where you can scroll through information on why it is important to consider heat risks, how the Heat Vulnerability Index was developed, and there are interactive dashboards where you can get information for individual wards. There's also information on measures we can take to manage heat risks within the city. We've also included a feedback form which we encourage you to fill out and let us know what you think about this service and how it is being used. And there's a link to the story map at the bottom of this slide. Overall, initial feedback on the heat pack and the Tier 2 service has been overwhelmingly positive. The maps have been a real hit with users. Belfast City Council have highlighted several projects where information from the heat service will be useful. For example, they are currently updating their severe weather plan to include heat risks and require evidence to incorporate within their updates. Also, the council are developing and renewing their council and city climate plans, as well as undertaking adaptation of their estate, which this information will be useful for. And it's also going to be feeding into a tree planting project as well. Thank you for listening to this presentation today. If you do have any further questions, please use the email address provided to get in contact with us.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for your presentation. And as you will have realised, that was a pre-recorded presentation. So if you have any questions for Victoria, you can contact her directly. I think we're also putting her email address in the chat box. We have a number of questions that have come in as part of this session, but I perhaps just want to kick off one question, and that's for you, Erica. And that's in relation to the very interesting housing data that was presented. Which changes do you think provide the greatest opportunity?
In terms of housing, then I think the whole component of social housing need really does need to be addressed. I think it's data that every time I look at it, I just think that really does need to be addressed. It's quite shocking. And I think also the other thing that brings up around, I know that some of the work the housing executive do, they care for their tenants a lot, but putting together some of the housing data, looking at the fact that there's a higher proportion of one adult households or one adult households with children. Some of those people are going to be in social housing needs. They're also going to be, in terms of their health and well-being, they're going to be relatively isolated. So there's a large component, I think, as well for mental health and well-being and isolation that comes into this, as well as the health impacts of either being in housing need, even if you're accepted as homeless. You know, a lot of people are then put into temporary accommodation in Belfast. I didn't put the data up, but there is data showing how long people spend in temporary accommodation. And again, that's quite shocking, especially if people do have children, even if they're a lone parent family, you know, that's more of a stress. So for me, the social housing need for Belfast, you take that in relation to the areas of deprivation. Belfast North and West have the highest number of households in housing stress. You know, it's a serious problem.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Erica. We have a number of questions that have come in, and maybe the first two of those are directed to yourself, Joan. One is to do with the lack of public toilets and seats that have been identified for many years. So it's just on the progress of that. If you have any insight?
Unfortunately, it's not a question that really is for Healthy Cities. I think it's more of a question for City Council or DFI. I do know that in relation to the walk assessments that we carried out, particularly in relation to older people and women, and actually this conversation came up yesterday at the Green in the City workshop in relation to public toilets and availability for carers of young adults or children who had a disability. That it has become an issue. So it's probably something that perhaps the People and Communities Committee, I think they have responsibility for parks and leisure within City Council. My understanding is whoever owns the land is responsible for the public toilets. So it's probably something that needs to go to the members in People and Communities Committee, but it has become particularly with the increased number of people that are walking and encouraged to walk. And as we, you know, the evidence is that women require toilets more so than men, and that it's largely people with disabilities are looking for them as well. So sorry, I can't answer your question, Michael or William, but we probably need to put it to City Council.
Okay, thanks very much. And then another one, I mean, we've had quite a number of conversations about networking and partnerships, Joan. And the question is, how important is the partnership network in championing sustainable and healthy messages, and what body should take the lead on that?
I mean, I think this is a key question, and I suppose Healthy Cities have been trying to make those links over the years and lead on those. Even, you know, the walking bus project that we had earlier just in May actually is an example of that. But I mean, we're not an organisation. We can introduce new themes and lead on particular projects, but Healthy Cities is not an organisation to actually continue to lead on these. This, I'm just wondering, is this somewhere where that the Belfast Agenda, community planning could actually take a lead on? Or I know Institute of Public Health, for example, are hosting a conference very soon on planet and health. So is it, this probably sits with Department of Health or Public Health Agency in Belfast, probably Public Health Agency of Belfast City Council, and it's the opportunities where they come together, and probably community planning is the current infrastructure that actually could lead on that. But it's a key question.
Okay, thanks very much. And then moving back to yourself, Erica, we have a question which has come in looking for more information in terms of the Belfast Council Awards as opposed to North, South, East and West. And any response, Erica?
Yeah, well, it would be nice. Yes, I agree with William. It would be nice. And I'm afraid in the profile, we were more or less limited to the data that's readily available. In terms of the district electoral areas, we do have quite a lot of data in the Prosperity chapter, which was launched a couple of weeks ago, whereby we look at a lot of the education indicators in that finer grain detail. And I will agree that that's very helpful. There's a bit more information sometimes at a DEA level for some of the peace indicators, but it's very patchy, and the best we can do in most cases is the assembly areas or the local government district. Sometimes super output area, you can have the deprivation data at that level, which again we've put in, but for the bulk of the data we have, no, it's not available at that level. Yes, we'd like it, so sorry, William, but that's something you'll have to take up with the people who collect it. But obviously, the finer grain detailed data you have, the better it is for people working at a local level. But we've tried wherever possible to use data that's relevant to Belfast or the assembly areas, and where possible, DEAs. But it's not easy. I appreciate that. But what I would say about where data is not so much available at a lower level, then working with communities and also the people who serve those communities on the front line, they will know. And I think there's a role, and Belfast Healthy Cities does a lot of this work of looking at data collection at a local level, including people in the community who know that community well. That can help if you're working on a specific project. And I know Belfast Healthy Cities has been doing work in the north on that in the care zone.
Thanks, Erica. And maybe staying with yourself, we have a question in from Roy White. I'm not sure if it's within your remit or not, but the question is: higher population density and higher percentage of apartments and terraced houses are linked with higher heat vulnerability.
Yeah.
But this sort of housing is also best to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Can we mitigate against heat vulnerability? And there's an addition then, do we have to choose between building more but less well insulated homes, or fewer but better insulated homes?
I would go for, we need the homes, especially as the population ages and also population family structures change, and Belfast has to just accommodate the fact that there are more single adults living in households of whatever nature in terms of their housing. I think you have to come to terms with what's happening demographically, recognise the housing need there is in the city, but then build with climate resilience involved. So there isn't any reason why, now we know what builds are not good for heat vulnerability risk. We know what we need to do. That has a cost associated with it. But, this is for planners, architects, designers to start working on housing that is appropriate for a high density population, an aging population, a population that's increasingly got one adult with children households, and making those dwellings as climate resilient as possible. And I think, again, if we're talking about urgent housing need, joining up the housing need for the city as it stands at present with some of the climate vulnerability issues that Victoria's so well explained, has pointed out, then, you know, that's where focus has got to be in future, especially as the domestic sector for Belfast, the climate carbon emissions are increasing as a sector, whereas transport, they're decreasing.
Thanks very much, Erica. Moving across, Joan, I just had a thought, really as a parent and as a school governor, what are some of the critical success factors of the Healthy Places, Healthy Children Schools resource?
Okay. I think key to the success of that was it was an agenda that was a common agenda, so it met the needs of the schools and education authority in terms of the world around us curriculum, and it also met Healthy Cities or the health agenda in terms of increasing understanding about the relationship between environment and health. And I think that has been core to the success of that. And I suppose when we look at any partnership working where there is a common agenda, you know, people, you know, organizations or sectors come together, and I think that has been key to that success.
If I could add, though, because Joan won't say this, I think one of the most important things about that work is listening to the children. I mean, you engage the children, and then you extended that further to make the guidelines to help other organisations work with and listen to children. And I think that was also an important part of the success, and the engagement that happened, not just with the children, but then of course with the teachers, and then wanting further support. So if I'm allowed to interject.
Well, and I suppose added to that is the experience of partnership working, Ian, and you know that Healthy Cities is an intersectoral body, so we don't have a core agenda of our own, but looking for that common agenda.
Thanks very much. We have an avid cyclist in the room, and we noticed that a lot of the data that was presented finishes just before the COVID outbreak. Yes. Is there any initial information coming through or data coming through in terms of any increase in cycling or walking?
To be honest, I haven't looked at the cycling data. I've looked at more data related to deprivation more, so what's happened with housing need, and as you might imagine, the data that's come through on housing need, there's been an increase. So I'm afraid I didn't look at the cycling data. To be honest, cycling is pretty low compared with walking in Belfast. And I think that's also coming from Oxford, where a lot of people cycle, not Copenhagen, sadly, but coming from Oxford, where a lot of people cycle. I would say that some of the infrastructure here for cyclists, you know, well, you're a capital city, we're not, obviously, we're tiny compared with you, but a lot of the infrastructure is not necessarily conducive to cycling, especially among people who are not avid cyclists. You know, if you're going to encourage women or older people or children to cycle. So you still have quite a car-dominated environment, and whether, if there was any increase in cycling during the pandemic, whether that's now dropped off again, I don't know. But I haven't specifically looked at that. I've been looking at some of the housing need, housing benefit data, what's happened. We also looked at what might have happened to domestic abuse, etc. So I've been looking at that sort of more intense, if you like, situations that happened during COVID.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have one last question, and that's for yourself, Erica. Just trying to kind of round up all of the kind of discussion and presentations that have taken place this morning. What data is not available that would be needed to inform the way forward for the work on Place and Planet?
I definitely think there is a huge gap in terms of greening in its widest sense, so green spaces in the city. I know that DARA have commissioned some work from Outdoor NI to look at some of that on a Northern Ireland level, but in terms of looking at biodiversity, adaptation, mitigation, green, blue spaces, there seems to me to be a lot of data that we were struggling to find to Belfast, and I felt we were going back to sort of, I don't know, almost 1950s conservation era kind of data compared with the carbon emissions data you can get hold of. It just seems to me that there's not much, and if we were talking at a, you know, going back to William's question, if we were talking at a ward level, obviously the data that Victoria's presented is fantastic, but that cost a lot of money to do that. I mean, that's high quality mapping and an awful lot of modelling. You know, if you look at the ordinary data available for greening, both in relation to people's health and well-being, but then also in relation to climate change adaptation and mitigation, biodiversity, I would say that's a real gap.
Thank you. And I know greening the city is close to your heart, Joan. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, absolutely, because I mean, we did have the workshop, and it's one of our key programs this year. And what the discussion yesterday actually raised the issue of, you know, looking at, and I know City Council has done some of this work, but mapping the green space, but in terms of quality, in terms of accessibility, and in terms also of the use or activities within that green space. I mean, lovely to have, and we have some wonderful parks. We've very minimum green space in the city centre in comparison to other cities. Like, we don't have this concept of pocket parks that a number of other English cities have. But we have the Cave Hill, we have Botanic. But there's something about how do we use that green space actually to improve some of the huge public health issues we have, like tackling obesity, increasing physical activity. So that was part of the discussion yesterday, and hopefully that's the sort of, they're the sort of projects that we can actually begin to look at, you know, and take forward over the next 2 to 3 years.
That's fantastic. And of course, enticing young families into the city centre, where there's places for the kids to play, etc. So that's us, I think. I just want to thank Joan and Erica and Victoria for their outstanding presentations this morning, and the answering of the questions. You're really on the ball. I thought that was fantastic. So thank you very much. So that really brings to a close then the Place and Planet chapters aspect of the Belfast Health Profile. I just want to finish by also thanking all of the people here today who were able to make this event possible, and thank you again for your continued support and for your interest in Belfast Healthy Cities. So thank you very much. Goodbye.